Just a note before we get into this episode. The following interview contains discussions of sexual assault, violence and murder. Between the commercial centres of Burwood and Strathfield in Sydney's inner west lies the suburb of Croydon, about 9 kilometres from Sydney's central business district. Churches, schools and old brick homes make up the streets of Croydon, with almost half of its population born overseas. Tosha Thakkar was one of those residents. Born in India and living in Australia under a student visa. With long, straight black hair and dark arresting eyes, 24-year-old Tosha lived in a rundown boarding house on Edwin Street, only 5 minutes from Croydon railway station. Her boyfriend often came to visit her room, small but homely, with a Persian rug, a yellow bedspread and a small Hindu shrine. On the morning of March 7, 2011, Tosha woke late and put together a plan to meet her boyfriend for lunch. But the man in the room next door had been awake for hours. He also had a plan, and it involved a crime so violent and so horrific that many have never ever forgotten about it. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In this episode, we're speaking with journalist and author Greg Callaghan. Greg is a writer and associate editor of The Good Weekend in the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. He reported on the murder of Tosha Thakkar and wrote a feature published in The Good Weekend titled My Neighbour, My Killer. Can you talk us through how Tosha Thakkar's last day began?
Yeah, her last day, which was Wednesday, March 9, 2011, began pretty quietly, actually. She'd worked late at Woolies in Surrey Hills the evening before. She didn't have classes until later in the day, and she was actually going to be meeting a boyfriend for lunch. So she had a bit of a sleep-in that morning.
She was on a student visa, wasn't she? So she hadn't been born in Australia. How long had she been here and what was she studying?
She arrived in Australia 4 years earlier on a student visa, and she was studying accountancy, which is how she actually met her boyfriend, Ali.
And how long had she been with her boyfriend at that stage?
I think they'd been together for probably the better part of about a year or so, and certainly the relationship was formalised. He would come and stay over, and they had plans to marry. So it was pretty serious. He was a very serious and dignified young man.
So she was living in this boarding house in Croydon where he'd often come and visit her. Can you tell us a little bit about what sort of suburb Croydon is?
Yeah, well, Croydon's pretty much an upper middle class suburb now. It's a suburb in Sydney's inner west, an established suburb. It was probably settled post-World War One period, probably mainly built in the 20s, 30s and 40s. A suburb these days, like most inner city areas, certainly is pretty close to the city. It's it's mainly populated by professionals and people have been living there for a long time. And like many sort of strip shopping roads along the station, the shops there had sort of seen better days in terms of their business because, like a lot of suburban shopping strips, malls that opened within easy driving distance. So the shops at Croydon were a bit of a mix. There were some nice, trendy restaurants catering to the local population, but there were also a few boarded-up shops as well, businesses that had gone out of business.
Where she was living, this boarding house, can you describe it? Because was it sort of like it had little individual rooms? Were there shared areas in it as well?
Yeah, it was basically a boarding house that you'd probably describe it as a low-rent boarding house. If you actually saw the area, what it was is a large open-plan room, really, above a shop, which had actually been in its glory days a nail salon in Croydon. And the upstairs area was pretty much sort of originally, I gather, barring a little hallway, it was pretty much an open-plan big area. And what the owner of the property had done is kind of divided it up into 3 rooms, with plywood walls. But the problem was that these plywood walls didn't actually go up to the ceiling. There was about a 20-centimetre gap. So it was pretty much a kind of, as we'd say in the old days, a bodgy sort of job, a very, very cheap sort of do-up. And there was a shared bathroom and a shared kitchenette as well. There was a security door at the end of the little hallway. Basically, like most residences behind old shops, I should say, or above old shops, I should be more correct, you'd actually access them through the back. So there was a laneway at the back of the property, and there was a big staircase, external staircase that went up to these flats. So the shop below, which faced the street on the other side, was all boarded up. So Tosha and the other people living in the boarding house at that time, who were her murderer, Daniel St Reginald, and another older gentleman, they would enter the property from the laneway at the back. Now the laneway, between the laneway and the property, there was a big high fence and a locked gate. As I say, there was a security door at the end of the hallway, which led onto these rooms. And I might add that this was a prime reason why Tosha actually took this rental property. Apart from the fact it was very cheap, it was only about $125 a week, she felt secure there because it was off the main drag, but it was also very, very secure.
And could you tell us a little bit about that young man that lived next door, Daniel St Reginald? What was he like? What was he doing at the time?
Well, Daniel St Reginald was 19 years old, effectively a teenager. He was, or he is, he's still alive, he's in prison, so I'm not sure why I'm talking about him in the past tense. But at the time, back in 2011, he was 19 years old. He was working in Cass Brothers, a local plumbing supply place. He often bragged to his friends that as a plumber, there was no such thing. He basically just tore open boxes and did inventory and put PVC pipes on shelves and so forth. He came with his family from Sri Lanka. They were refugees, but there was a very, very dark past associated with Daniel St Reginald. His father actually killed his mother, which, says that there was obviously a very violent streak that was running in the male line in that family.
Did he witness that? How close was he to that event taking place? Because that's an incredibly traumatic thing to happen in someone's childhood. You don't get much more traumatic than that.
Yes, indeed. It is incredibly traumatic. He did the parts of the violence, I believe. Obviously, that's had some effect on him. But it's the mystery, isn't it, of nature-nurture environment versus what's inside of you, what's working in your head, because other people, many other young men and young women witness violence like that at quite a young age and go on traumatised, but they go on to have very productive, peaceful lives. St Reginald was not a peaceful man. He had very, very violent fantasies. And where those came from, the easy diagnosis would be, he's a psychopath, or as we call it today, a sociopath. But where that came from, is a bit of a mystery.
And so he was living next door to Tosha, and obviously she had no idea about any of this. What did the inside of his little sort of area, what did that look like? What was his residence like?
Well, his little room that Tosha never actually saw was slightly creepy, to be honest. He trained a little bit. He had dumbbells in the room, but he also had all these bottles that were filled with his urine. He had a taste for very violent pornography that he would access on his notebook computer in his room. He always wore headphones, so nothing was heard. As I say, there was only a plywood wall between these rooms, plus there was a 20-centimetre or so gap at the top. So you wouldn't imagine that the noise insulation would be much chop. So obviously he didn't want any of his neighbours to hear all this stuff that he was watching, so he would wear headphones while he watched all this pornography. What was his life like? pretty limited, really. He didn't have a lot of friends. He had a history, a criminal history. He went to his job and basically came home. He didn't seem to have any hobbies much. Another disturbing thing was that he'd actually broken a hole through the plywood wall downstairs in the shop, which enabled him, if he went downstairs, because he could get through a door downstairs into the old abandoned shop, he could actually get out onto the street that way by unlocking the door internally. So that showed yet another, not that we needed any sense of premeditation in this case because it was a planned murder, but it does show another element of premeditation in the way that he didn't want to be seen or any sort of witnesses see him come and go.
You say that he had a criminal history. What had he done in the past? What kind of association had he had with the police?
He had a disturbing criminal history. He wasn't so much a thief, although he was a thief as well, full-time thief. It was more about physical violence. He actually attempted to rape two women at knife point, a 24-year-old and a 26-year-old, both in Meadowbank, actually near the spot where Tosha's body would be found 18 months later in the suitcase. So he knew this sort of territory. He knew his backyard pretty well. And he was actually, for these horrendous attacks, he was incarcerated for 9 months. But bearing in mind he's a juvenile. And the justice system, rightly or wrongly, the people of that age is very capable of rehabilitation. So they do tend to get lighter sentences. And he was actually released September 2010. So we're only talking of just over a year, 16 months or so before he killed Tosha. He was released. And that was in large part due to the fact that the two women dropped charges. They, understandably didn't want to go through the trauma of the courtroom. And so they dropped the charges. In the fullness of time, that would have a tragic result.
When Daniel was living next door to Tosha, how old was he?
When he was living next door to Tosha, he was only 19 years old. Pretty much by today's standards, he was a boy, at 18 or 19 in generations past. Boys that age went off to Vietnam or they went off to Gallipoli or they went off to the Second World War. But by today's standards, we see a 19-year-old is still pretty much a boy. But as I say, he led a fairly insular life. He didn't have a lot of friends. He tended to just go to his job at Cass Brothers and come home and didn't do a lot on weekends, didn't go out very much. So he wasn't, by any stretch of the imagination, your typical 19-year-old.
Had he and Tosha ever crossed paths while they'd been living together?
Yeah, they would pass one another in the corridors, and occasionally Daniel would see Tosha hanging her washing out on the Hills hoist in the backyard of his property. One day, not long, only weeks in fact, before he killed her, she'd locked herself out of her room. She was with a boyfriend at the time. They were actually in the boarding house upstairs. They'd actually got through the security doors, okay, but she'd lost the key to the actual room. Starney Reginald appeared to be the perfect gentleman. He got a ladder, actually climbed over the top of the plywood wall that went over the doorway and opened the door from the inside. He seemed to be, from all appearances, the perfect kind neighbour.
So on the morning of March 9, Tosha is walking out of her bathroom, as you say. She was planning on going to meet her boyfriend in the city. What happened?
It was a pretty horrendous series of events. That morning he'd been up early. While she had been sleeping in, he'd been up early perfecting his plan, watching more pornography. He heard her in the shower, came out of the room. She was walking down the hallway, grabbed her and basically had a rubber cord that he put around her neck and pulled her back into his room. Now, Tosha was a judo expert. She was quite small in stature. She was only 163 centimetres tall and about 55 kilos. She really did put up a fight, but Starney Reginald was a strong, stocky man who was intent to commit violence of the most horrendous kind.
At 12:45, we know that he's picked up by a taxi outside and taken to Meadowbank Park. What does he do from there? Why is he going to a park?
Well, this seems pretty remarkable to a lot of people. It certainly, in the fullness of the investigation, made it easy to convict him. But he called a taxi to take him to Meadowbank Park, and he dragged the suitcase down the stairs of the rooms at the back of the shop, across the laneway and around the corner, and the taxi actually picked him up in front of the abandoned nail salon. So he was carrying his dead body in one of those large, flexible suitcases out in public for some minutes. Not that anybody would know, because he'd very carefully folded Tosha's body up inside the suitcase. But it was still 63 kilos worth. The taxi driver, as per taxi drivers, helps you with your luggage in the back. And he said, "Mate, what on earth is in this?" And the Stony Regional sort of said, "Oh, just computers and wires." He sat in the front of the taxi, if I'm remembering that correctly. I think he sat in the front. But what was absolutely the case was that he was in a pretty light, joyful mood. He was cracking jokes with the driver and smiling, and just seemed like he was having a nice afternoon. When the taxi driver dropped him off, he took the suitcase out of the back and then dragged along a concrete pathway into Meadowbank Park, following the course of a stormwater canal that's not far from where he assaulted those women 16 or 17 months earlier.
Why do you think he went to Meadowbank Park? Because that's not, as you know, is clear, it's a taxi ride away. Do you think he felt as though this is somewhere that suitcase would never be found?
He chose the canal because he was under the impression that the suitcase, because it was so heavy, would sink to the bottom and would be forever covered in water, and so wouldn't be found, at least not for a long time. Now, I don't know how familiar he was with canals in Sydney, but as we all know, that they can empty pretty quickly. This was an absolutely fierce summer. We've had quite a few of these really torturous summers in Sydney and, right across Australia, with, temperatures increasing in recent years. But this one was the hottest summer. This summer of 2010, 2011 was the hottest summer then in 30 years. And there wasn't a lot of water flowing in the next couple of days. So what happened was, and what he wasn't anticipating, was that the bag actually got snared on a tree branch and didn't move with the canal. So it wasn't sort of washed deeper into sort of an underground canal or tunnel. So it got stuck, and with the heat and with just a lower level of water going through the canal, the suitcase was exposed, the top of the suitcase.
And this is a suburban park, around, I guess around 1 o'clock by this point. Did anyone see him dispose of this suitcase? Because that would be a very kind of odd sight to witness.
Some workers who are actually doing labouring work near the canal saw him carrying a suitcase. It's a pretty odd sight when you think of it. Why would you be taking a large suitcase into a public park? Maybe if you're on your way home and you're taking a shortcut cut across the park, but it just seemed like a bit of an odd sight, particularly at the middle of the day. And then they did sort of see him chuck the bag into the canal. There were a couple of witnesses. However, people are busy, they have short attention spans, so the people who saw that sort of kind of dismissed it at the time. And it was actually the labourers working near the canal who saw the suitcase and thought, oh, what's that? An Irishman, a young bloke who'd come out from Ireland and was doing some labouring work. And he looked across at this large black bag poking out above the water near this tree branch. And they wondered what it was, and they went out. They kind of just basically sloshed through the water and used a Stanley knife to cut the bag open. And what did they see was, unfortunately, the very upsetting sight of a young woman's painted toe.
How many days was that after the suitcase had been disposed of that it was actually found?
It was remarkably only 2 days. It was actually the Friday morning. She was murdered on the Wednesday morning. On the Friday morning, while Stony Regional was at work at Cass Brothers, that stormwater canal flow had dropped back so much, as I said, that the suitcase was exposed. Now, the discovery of the suitcase and the fact that he was a prime suspect so early probably saved others' lives, because amongst the many pretty stomach-churning searches that he did on Google was beginnings of a serial killer. So I don't think there's a lot of doubt, and given the reports, his psychological reports, that he would have gone on to murder others if he hadn't been caught so quickly. And the cops really, and I shouldn't say the cops really, I should say the police, because they really do deserve our respect. In cases like this, it was an absolutely first-class investigation. They acted really quickly because they were worried that he was going to strike again.
Am I right in saying that when they did go through his computer and found what he was searching, that he actually had almost like a particular type of woman that he was targeting? Like, didn't he specifically have sort of a fantasy about a woman, like an Indian young woman? Did that put her more sort of at risk, that kind of profile?
That's an excellent question, because unfortunately Tosha was absolutely his type. He had a fantasy about Indian girls. And one thing I haven't done is describe Tosha. She was a very, very pretty 24-year-old girl. She had beautiful, arresting, these ebony eyes and this jet black hair. And, she was a very attractive young woman. So as, dark fate would have it, he was a sociopath with a fetish for young Indian women, living right next door to a very beautiful young woman who put good faith in others.
Going back to that Wednesday, Tosha was obviously meant to meet her partner, and as the afternoon goes on, he, his girlfriend doesn't show up. What did he then do when he can't get on to her and it just appears that she's disappeared into thin air?
Well, as you can imagine, when your loved one is missing, you go into a state of near panic. Ali Syed was, needless to say, incredibly anxious. And loved ones get more anxious when the person they're concerned about does something that's totally out of character. Now, Tosha was very, very good at always staying in contact, always sending text messages, always calling about, where she was and times and so forth. So when he didn't hear from her, though, as I say, they were going to meet. He was working in a kind of a 7-Eleven type store in Bathurst Street at the time, and she was going into town, and they were then going to go and have lunch in a park, probably Hyde Park. So when he hadn't heard, and after she'd said that she would give him a call once she gets on the train, he started to become a bit concerned. Then he called again, Still, she didn't turn up at 12:30 as promised. By 2 o'clock, he'd had enough, was sufficiently concerned. He jumped in his car, left work, drove to Croydon, pulled up in the laneway behind the boarding house, which was how everybody got into the boarding house. So he had the sort of distressing scenario of climbing these steps to the second floor and then hearing music coming from his girlfriend's room, going there, and at first, initially thinking, maybe she's lost track of time or something, but that would seem bizarre and out of character. And he pushed open the unlocked door and then confronted with this kind of mystifying sight. Tosha's handbag, purse and phone were just lying there on the bed. Her mobile was flashing with all the missed calls and messages from him. There was a damp towel that was lying crumpled near the door, next to the thongs she always wore to the bathroom. But the thongs were a little bit, seemed oddly positioned. She was a very, very neat person, and they were kind of just like they'd been flung on the floor. The rice cooker was full but turned off with steamed rice. But he noticed that there was one thing. There was just something wasn't, needless to say, there wasn't right. So he started sort of having a close look at everything, and then he opened the wardrobe, and he noticed that her own nightie was missing. And it was something she always wore to the bathroom at the time. So Ali knew that something had happened. So he rang friends to establish whether anybody had seen Tosha. But it didn't take him long to call 000 and report her as a missing person. Meanwhile, other friends arrived, mutual friends of theirs, and they started fanning out through the local streets, searching for their friend, I mean, all sorts of things would have been going through his mind. Has she been abducted? Has she had an accident? Has she been out in the street? Has something happened and she's been taken away to hospital and he doesn't know about it? So, there were a lot of very, very fearful things going through his mind. And then he went up to Croydon station and started basically door knocking on the shops, asking if anyone had seen Tosha. The shops, I should explain, are basically, say, a strip shopping street that's right next door to the station. So often in murder cases like this, there's some kind of really weird, spooky kind of coincidence. And this happened when Ali was doing the door knocking of all these shops and asking, the shopkeepers whether they'd seen Tosha. I mean, she was known. She went and bought newspapers. She went to the local chemist and so forth. So he went to all the places, the shops that she normally went in. Nobody had seen her. But then he walked straight into Starney Reginald. Now, he recognised Starney Reginald because only 2 weeks earlier, as I say, Starney Reginald had been the knight who helped Tosha get into her room. He was the bloke, the helpful neighbour who climbed over the partition and opened the door from the inside. It was all smiles, it was all politeness. So Ali was, reasonably trusting of this guy and said, "Oh, well, have you seen Tosha, the girl who lives next door to you?" Or Starney Reginald could say was, no, I haven't seen her. And then he sort of blurted out, "I work at Cass Brothers and I leave at 8 a.m. and get home at 5 p.m. And he then sort of said, "Well, what's that red stain on your tongue? What's that?" And it was just the fact that Starney Reginald had an ice cream. I should explain here that his method of killing was strangulation. Basically, he sexually assaulted her multiple times and strangled her to death. So there wasn't blood, there wasn't obvious forensic stuff there or obvious evidence that would say immediately that somebody had been killed. So when he walked into the room that day and he looked around at all that stuff, there was no blood on the sheets, there was no blood on the floor. So he really didn't know exactly what had happened to her.
I want to talk about a man named Philip Colbert. He was interviewed by police at one point. What did he remember from that morning in March?
Well, Colbert lived he was the third person in the boarding house, this sort of 3-room boarding house, if you like. And he used to work night shift as a forklift driver. He was actually quite friendly with Tosha. He had a daughter her age. He was and because of his daughter, he was kind of protective of Tosha. They didn't know one another very well, but he always made sure when he left in the morning, in the early hours of the morning, that security door that I mentioned earlier at the end of the hallway on that second level was always locked. And when he went out through the gate at the back, he always made sure that it was locked before he left. He was sort of mindful. He was the type of bloke, the type of father who would go and pick up his teenage or early 20-something daughter from a party or from work just so that she wouldn't be walking down streets in the early hours of the morning, basically. He was a very dutiful sort of person. Coincidentally, he normally didn't get in until the early afternoon, but that day, the day of Tosha's murder, his shift ended earlier than normal. He was actually coming up the stairs and walking down the hallway when Starney Reginald was killing Tosha. Now, that might seem remarkable to people that in a place with very poor acoustics, he didn't hear something. Well, in fact, he did, but he mistook what he heard. He heard a mumbling and a kind of gasping sort of sound. It was faintly disturbing, but and then there was sort of like somebody was murmuring or saying something. And he actually dismissed it because he'd been working all night. He was tired. He was actually dropping off to sleep. He actually dismissed the noise as being Ali and Tosha having a bit of a lover's tiff. So he didn't for a moment think that anything horrible was happening one room away from him. Starney Reginald's room was right next door to Tosha's, and Philip's room was at the end of the corridor. So he was in fact one room away from where this was happening. He would have walked past Tosha's door, but he was effectively one room away from the murder scene. To describe it more accurately, to describe the rooms, Tosha's room was first, Stoney Reginald's room was second, and Philip's room was third. So Stoney Reginald was right next door to Tosha, but Philip was one room away. So it did make, just for that extra bit of distance, did probably make it a little more difficult for him to kind of investigate or be suspicious of the noise that was going on. He really did think that, it was that Ali was there and they might have been having a bit of an argument. No doubt, Stoney Reginald, when he heard the noise, when he heard the footsteps in the hallway that morning, he would have been shocked because he had planned this pretty meticulously. He knew what time Philip came home from the shift, so he was caught by surprise by this. So no doubt, if Tosha was willing and able and possibly going to scream or yell out, he would have covered her mouth and made that pretty much impossible.
And Daniel was also interviewed by police pretty quickly, obviously because of his proximity to her. What was his alibi?
He was both meticulous in his planning and rather careless as well. He said that he was working that morning. But one of the reasons that the police were onto this very quickly was that, one, obviously his alibi didn't check out, but it still takes time to check out alibis. And the second thing was because he had this history of sexual assault and violence. So there was an immediate red flag with that. In the meantime, he'd been called into the station with Philip. They weren't brought into the station together, but they went to the station at slightly different times and basically made statements. But as it turned out, their interviews at the local police station ended at pretty much the same time, and one of the detectives dropped them back to the boarding house after that. They were kind of people of interest, but weren't necessarily direct murder suspects at this point. But she was dropping them back to the boarding house, and Philip Culbert told me that he was sitting in the back of the car next to Stoney Reginald, and Stoney Reginald was all kind of sweetness and light and chatty and telling them what he was going to have for dinner that night and so forth. But Philip looked at the policewoman driving the car, and he noticed that she was looking at them very intensely, like searching their faces. And it pulled him up, and he thought, first of all, oh, do they consider me a murder suspect? And then he thought, well, maybe they consider Stoney Reginald, the man sitting next to me, a murder suspect.
And when the police did discover that he wasn't at work like he said he was, what evidence were they able to piece together about his movements that day?
They knew he wasn't at work, but they obviously they interviewed people at his place of work at Cass Brothers. Luckily, because he was a suspect so early, because he had this criminal record, because his alibi didn't check out, seized CCTV footage from the street in front of the nail shop very, very quickly, which is important because CCTV footage, as we know, can be wiped, or something can happen to the technology. It can be degraded, or something can happen if it isn't seized pretty quickly, and pretty much within 24 hours. And there it was, Stoney Reginald pulling this big black suitcase along the street, standing in front of the nail salon and waiting for the taxi to pull up. There he was, in the very suitcase where the body was found.
Was there any forensic evidence or DNA or anything that they were able to find in the room where Tosha was killed?
Yes, further down the track. I mean, contrary to all the cop shows we watch and we love to watch, DNA evidence takes some time to actually be confirmed, sometimes up to 2 weeks or more. It wasn't as if they were necessarily relying on the DNA evidence for a quick arrest. The DNA evidence became absolutely important in the courtroom. And yes, they did find evidence of hairs and other sort of forensic evidence in the room, which again pinned him to the crime.
Did he ever confess when all of this evidence has come out and it's clear that he did it? Did he confess to police?
No. No, in short. But look, the evidence was so overwhelming that he would have probably been better to plead guilty and show some remorse, show some sort of empathy for Tosha's family. He didn't, and he got it by the standards of someone his age, a pretty hefty sentence. But in some cases of crimes like his, oh boy, there's a part of many of us that think that this sort of person, this kind of psychopathy, this kind of predisposition for violence, this bad seed, if you like, should be kept off the street permanently, because this is a man who was nearly put in jail and wasn't for earlier sex crimes. And if he'd been in jail, Tosha would still be in Australia today and no doubt be married to Ali and no doubt have a good career as an accountant and be a happy woman.
And what was he sentenced to?
You know what? Mark Tedeschi, QC, urged the judge to impose a life sentence without parole on Stanley Reginald, arguing he's capable of seeking notoriety as a serial killer. This is a man who's going to reoffend. But Justice Derek Price sentenced Stanley Reginald to 45 years with a non-parole period of 30 years. So he could actually be back on the streets before he turns 50. He sat in the courtroom while the sentence was being given, absolutely stony-faced. He showed no empathy for Tosha's family. He showed absolutely no remorse for the crime.
The last thing I wanted to ask you was, as a journalist, you went and visited that premises in Croydon with the Good Weekend, I believe it was, and you came across what you described as a poignant sight on the street. What was it that you saw?
One of the things I wanted to do is go back to the boarding house in Edwin Street in Croydon. I'd been there a couple of times before, obviously, to check it out. But the last time I went, I actually went with Phil Culbert, the gentleman who lived in the third room, the gentleman who was there while, to his horror, sleeping while Stanley Reginald was murdering Tosha. He wanted to see what was in the backyard in the end. There was a pile of discarded goods in the middle of the yard. And it was very haunting because there were things like Tosha's Persian rug, her rice cooker was sitting there, and then her Avon bag was sitting at the top. I should say, we haven't mentioned that Tosha was quite bored with her job at Woolies in Surrey Hills, and she had just got a gig as an Avon lady, which she loved. So her Avon bag was sitting at the top. But also, littered about the place, almost like confetti, were all these letters and bills, and many water-damaged bills for Stanley Reginald. And I always remember the moment where Phil Culbert picked up Tosha's Avon bag and dusted it off, and just the expression on his face, and as a father myself, you think of what can happen to anybody, but particularly young women when there are people like Stanley Reginald about. So it was a very, very sad moment, actually.
Yeah, I think it brings it back to the humanity of Tosha as a victim, and, in a way that's what's left of her things, and I can't imagine the pain that her family will carry for the rest of their lives.
There's no getting over something like this. There are some very evil people in this life. The more conservative among us want those people sort of locked away forever. I've got to say, personally, I probably lean in that direction myself. I think people kill for any number of reasons. There can be crimes of passion. There can be spontaneous moments when we just lose everything, lose our sense of basic goodness, and we do something that we'll forever regret. But there's a whole other level about a crime when it's premeditated like this, when there's a kind of sexual thirst for it, when there's an enjoyment taken out of the violence that Stanley Reginald quite clearly followed. His behaviour isn't unlike many other serial killers. I've done other stories on other crimes, and these ones are the worst because they're perpetrated by people who enjoy them. They have this kind of boiling anger and hunger inside them that's only relieved by killing in this way. And Stoney Reginald, as I say, after the crime, was very light, very jovial in the taxi after he'd murdered somebody. This was only, look, he was getting into a taxi with a body in a suitcase only minutes after he killed this girl, and yet he was laughing with a taxi driver. He was laughing in the back of the police car with his neighbour only a day later. So what does that say about the psychology of the person? What does that tell you about their kind of absolute sort of lack of any moral centre? The fact that he was doing Google searches on serial killers and serial killers in the making tells me that he unquestionably, and given his record before this crime, would have committed others. And as I say, I've done stories on other potential serial killers, the murder of Morgan Huxley, a young gentleman on the lower north shore of Sydney, by Jack Kelsall. A similar scenario, to Stoney Reginald. Except Stoney Reginald came from a very extremely damaged background. Jack Kelsall didn't. He came from, but still that kind of psychology, that profile, if you like, of a sociopath, of a potential serial killer.
Absolutely. That's another very interesting case, but I can see what you mean, that there's just a real lack of empathy and I suppose even them having any remorse for what they did, which is perhaps the most eerie thing. But thank you so much for your time.
Look, it's a pleasure. I think it's important to talk about crimes like this because they give us an insight into the darker kind of corners of human beings at times, and I think there are lessons to be learned.
Absolutely. Greg Callaghan's reporting on the murder of Tosha Thakkar and the conviction of her killer can be found online via the link in the description of this episode. If you want to discuss this episode further, you can join our closed Facebook group. Just search for True Crime Conversations on Facebook. You can also email us if there's a case you think we should look into at truecrime@mamamia.com.au. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens, and produced by Elise Cooper.